Hello, friends. Okay, I've got another treat for you this week on the channel. We are going to restore a scene from the first high-definition film I ever shot back in 2006. We shot on the Canon XL-H1 in the United Kingdom. We went to Wales on an old Roman copper mine to shoot a Western. I'm from Texas, so there's some irony in that. But suffice to say that this was the best technology that us prosumer consumer folks had back in the day as independent amateur filmmakers. We managed to get our hands on one of the first high-definition HDV camcorders of the day. But the cool thing about XL-H1 was it had a very unique color science that we're going to talk about in this video. It had interchangeable lenses, and it had a kind of a really cool and sophisticated way of recording in true PAL signal, but then encoding that to the restrictions of the HDV format. I flew over to the UK recently to visit my dear friend who directed this film, and he had the original hard drive. We're going to remaster the original HDV source, which are .avi and Unix executable files. We're going to use a custom piece of software that I've made called HDVapourize, which utilizes Vapoursynth and FFmpeg and some other tools to restore that original high definition image, and we'll use NNEDI3 within Vapoursynth to do a slight upscale on the source material as well, and then we'll drop it into DaVinci Resolve and apply a color grade and make it look like an old Western. So getting back to the creative intent of the cinematographer and director back in the day, it's taken me 20 years to get there, but here I am, I'm finally doing it. So this has been a big project for me. I hope you enjoy it, and please leave some comments down below and let me know what you think. Files that I got from my buddy in the UK, they were originally captured using Final Cut Pro 7 back in 2006, straight from the Canon XL-H1 system right into the log and capture tool in Final Cut Pro 7. And for whatever reason, the capture file format was a Unix executable files, which is fine. We can convert those, but that requires a rewrap, so to speak. So it was basically the raw original HDV data inside of a file, but it had no wrapper. It didn't have an extension like a .mov or a .avi. So basically what I had to do is write a rewrap.py script that essentially just takes whatever this arbitrary input format is, even if it's AVI, and rewraps it without doing any sort of transcoding or re-encoding. It's important to stay as lossless as possible, as true to the original source as possible. So what I noticed was that the metadata had mentioned in media info that the original codec or method that had been captured was using the Apple intermediate codec. So I'd initially tried rewrapping to that, to an MOV, and keeping that codec as same as the original capture. But I actually found that if I re-encoded to a lossless format like ProRes 422HQ, I actually ended up getting better restores later in the pipeline. I haven't quite dialed in or tracked down why that is, but suffice to say that I was getting better results by simply rewrapping and encoding to ProRes 422HQ, but maintaining the original field lines and not doing any sort of de-interlacing or any processing whatsoever. I'm just simply re-encoding to mezzanine 422HQ and rewrapping, putting that into a .mov container. I did try FFV1. I was getting some errors in the pipeline. I wanted to go to FFV1 originally because that's, of course, best practices in restoration. But I have only tried FFV1 and ProRes 422HQ as well as AIC, or Apple Intermediate Codec. And ProRes has given me the best results. Someday I'd love to tweak this so that we rewrap to FFV1 into an MKV container, but we will get there someday. Now, the upscale script itself, this is the only Vapoursynth script that I have, and what's cool about Vapoursynth is it's step by step. You know, however you order your script to process whatever filters or plugins that you use to process your source video, actually goes step by step in the script. So step 1, step 2, step 3. So I'm just going to take you through that real quick. Beyond the general housekeeping stuff up here up top, the first thing I did was I upsampled to 10-bit we've got an HDV 8-bit source, 420, and I wanted to upsample that to 10-bit 422. I wanted to mitigate contouring effects and essentially put this into a larger bit container so that it was dithered and smoother. I've always had better results by upsampling the bit depth and the chroma subsampling, but adding a little bit of a dither. So this is what this step is right here. So we upsample and dither, and I used error diffusion for our dither, and it's given me fantastic results so far. The next thing I did, you might notice here, this says set DCI-P3 color space properties. You might be wondering, huh? Why is he doing that with an HDV camera? Well, the really kind of bizarre mystery that I had with this project was every time I brought in the remastered clips or the restored media into DaVinci Resolve and applied a Rec. 709 color transform to the footage in order to prepare it for the color pipeline out, I was noticing that the colors looked oversaturated and slightly jaundiced. There was something off about them. So I went into the manual for the XL-H1 and I downloaded some brochures, and there's not a lot of information about this camera's color science. Zooming back in time to 2006, when we shot this film, you had three choices for gamma curves in the camera menu: normal, Cine 1, Cine 2. Now, whatever that meant, God knows. There was a little blurb about it in the manual that says, you know, it's that Cine 1 and Cine 2 was meant to more accurately reproduce a film-like look. And that's like totally subjective to me. I didn't quite understand what it meant at the time. I just knew, hey, that's the Cine mode that you shoot in if you really want it to look like film. So I shot in Cine 2. You can see the gamma curve here, sort of a lower contrast curve. And the color matrix, you can choose between normal, Cine 1, and Cine 2. Okay, that's super vague. So I had no idea what this color space was. I had just assumed it was Rec. 709 because in the early 2000s, when the high definition standard was being adopted across the industry, well, the industry had invented Rec. 709, and that Rec. 709, BT 1886, these curve and color primaries, the coefficients, that had been essentially developed for the high definition standard. And since this is a high definition video camera, I just assumed that it was Rec. 709. I also looked in the metadata tag for the original capture scratch, and it said the coefficients and the primaries were all Rec. 709. So why did it not look right? So I banged my head up on the wall with this for a while until I found a brochure for the product that was launched in the early or even earlier 2000s. And I found the color matrix section here. It says that Cine 2 setting is a matrix that is for images being transferred to film. Aha. I think some very clever engineers at Canon realized that they were limited by the rigid specifications of the HDV format set out in H.262 MPEG 2 Part 2, which states that Rec. 709 color primaries and gamma coefficient is a must when you're recording HDV to tape. Whatever you're outputting via HDI, or HDSDI or SDI, or however you're monitoring, that's a completely separate issue. But when you're recording to HDV tape, you're limited to Rec. 709 color primaries and gamma coefficients. However, engineers, that's not the way they think. They're always trying to figure out clever workarounds and ways of optimizing the image. And I think that they came up with a really brilliant way to rotate the color primaries within the rigid limitations of the HDV standard, that when you applied a DCI-P3 color transform and gamma coefficient transform later on in the color management pipeline, you would get more accurate colors and more accurate gamma. That's why whenever I applied a DCI-P3 transform over the top of our footage, it looked great. In this pipeline, I'm just going to stick with DCI-P3 through and through. And I've even applied that DCI-P3 transform and the coefficient transform and the Vapoursynth script that I've written. So respect for the Canon engineers for figuring this out and giving us a little bit more accurate colors by a clever workaround within the XL-H1 camera's internal electronics and the way that they record the color matrix and the way they transform the gamma coefficients. So anyway, it's just a theory, but hey, I put the DCI-P3 transform on this and it looks great. I should state that I did spend many hours of research on the internet trying to find as much documentation as I could about the specific camera and the Cine 2 profile. And I think the reason why it's hard to find is because it's proprietary and it's Canon's little recipe that they built into the camera, and it's impossible to reverse engineer short of doing an actual quantitative analysis with a camera test and some calibrated color charts. I did purchase on eBay the Canon XL-H1, which is like the little brother to the XL-H1, because it uses the same sensor and the same computer and electronics inside, minus a number of features, and it doesn't have the interchangeable lens system and some of the fancier doodads that professionals were looking for at the time. Perhaps in a later episode, when I have more time, I'd love to do my own camera test with this to validate my assumption, and perhaps even make a custom LUT for the community so that we can just do a proper color transform with as much accuracy and confidence as we can into Rec 709 mastering and preservation pipelines. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll do that in the future. If that's something that people are interested in watching as a video, then I will take the time to make it. Okay, so moving on from step 1B for our DCI P3 color space transform, moving on to our interlacing. So I use QTGMC to de-interlace. Sometimes people say the placebo is overkill, but the cool thing about placebo is it allows you to utilize a number of other very powerful parameters that you cannot use unless you are in placebo mode. And feel free to read through those and the purpose that each of them serve. That's beyond the scope of this video today. Step 3, I do a square pixel conversion. So we start, this camera records in HDV, which is 1440 by 1080, which has 4:3 pixels. It's really kind of interesting though, because it really shows you the legacy that we've inherited in the video industry. Because at the time, we were obviously operating with 4:3 pixels. We were in a 4:3 universe, so it makes sense. The math makes sense. But HDV was kind of like a bridge between the standard definition world and the high definition world. I guess some compromises had to be made in the engineering department. I think that later on, the square pixel became much more of a thing, thanks to Dr. Charles Boynton and his advocacy on the square pixel ratio, which actually ends up making a lot of the math a little bit better later on in the pipeline. And that's primarily why I convert to, once we've done the de-interlace, this is why I convert to square pixel ratio and bring us back to 1920 by 1080, so that a lot of the other processing further on the pipeline, the math is a little bit more efficient, a little more accurate. I get better results out of it. Again, a little bit beyond the scope of this video, but suffice to say that converting your pixel aspect ratio is just good due diligence. Moving on to step 4, what I ended up doing was I ended up separating the 3 planes YUV. I wanted to have complete luma and chroma separation, as well as the separate chroma channels. So we basically separate them into 3 separate planes, and then we process those 3 separate planes separately, and then recombine those planes back together later on. One thing that I want to point out is the vertical smoothing. The reason I do this is because what you'll notice about some archival that may be HDV or mini DV is that some of the latent interlacing artifacts can remain even after you've de-interlaced the source clip. Primarily, those interlaced artifacts may be a result from poor processing, or because you've processed with a faster setting, so that you haven't devoted as much computational resources to the interpolation and really fine-tuning and getting down there and fixing some of those latent combing artifacts. The thing that bugs me though is, particularly with bright colors, let's say a sunset or high contrast areas, sometimes the chroma combing artifacts will remain post-processing. And that's something that is not necessarily, it's not the fault of your processing or of your ability to utilize Vapoursynth to remove a lot of those latent artifacts. It may just be because the camera system and the algorithm used to encode the chroma and luma into separate interlaced fields, and all the math that's going on there and the image processing that's going on in the chip and the onboard computer inside the XL-H1 or the whatever source camera that you're using, maybe that's falling short. And I think that was the primary takeaway, was that back in early 2000s, maybe we just hadn't gotten there yet. Maybe the image processing chips that were inside these camera systems, they've come a long way over the years, and in the early 2000s, maybe the math just wasn't there. So we get a lot of latent interlacing artifacts that are inherent in the source footage. And so we just have to deal with that. It is what it is. I can't go back in time. Perhaps we'll have better technology someday that we'll get back in and be able to process those interlaced field lines in a more precise way and mitigate some of those chroma combing artifacts. But because those chroma artifacts are indeed there, I use a vertical smoothing filter, which is multipass. The multipass vertical smoothing, essentially what it does is it just kind of smooths out some of those horizontal chroma combing artifacts left over from the de-interlace in a way that makes it a little bit more organic, and it's a lot nicer, and I'll show you that later on. We do a lot of other chroma processing. I even do a little bit of horizontal smoothing, although I backed off quite a bit my first try, because the horizontal smoothing was a little bit too aggressive, and I wanted to make sure to maintain as much integrity of the original image as possible. We recombined the planes here after all the chroma processing, and I've commented out my MV Tools temporal processing because we don't necessarily need that for this data set. I use NNEDI3 for a 2x upscale to UHD, and this is pretty straightforward. I use as high quality as possible that I thought gave me the best bang for my buck. I could have used a larger neighborhood, but I didn't really see any increase in the results over computational resources and time that was required to process at a larger neighborhood. It wasn't quite worth it. But the rest of these settings, I in fact am very happy with. They've given me great results. So there are the parameters there. You can see them. And then of course I sanitize. I make sure that my final color transform, my color DCI P3 color space out is set. I know that we've already done that further upstream, but I just wanted to further sanitize it out because there were some issues with Vapoursynth and outputting DCI P3. So I made a cool app wrapped around my Python code base, and I've called it HDVapourize. It's using tkinter, which is a Pythonic user interface, very simple, kind of clunky, but it works. I'm not a software developer, so forgive me. Under settings, I set my path to my Python executable. I'm going to take my input. Before I do that, I'm going to change this to batch mode because we're going to be processing a whole directory of AVI files. Now, I would have loved to have had access to the original Unix executable, but unfortunately only a few clips in the original Capture Scratch were in that format. So most of the source clips for our HDV material are .avi container. So we're going to rewrap that into a more modern, friendly, lossless codec. I tried, like I was saying earlier, to do everything in FFV1 for the entire pipeline, but I've been having issues with FFV1 and Vapoursynth, and I haven't quite figured that out. But that's a work in progress. But ProRes 422HQ is awesome. I've been getting great results with it so far. It's also very post-production friendly for most folks. It's, of course, not the purist's choice, but that's a work in progress. So we've inputted our directory, right? Yep, that's the one. And then we will, there we go. That's the directory we want with AVI. And then we will also put the HDV output. There we go. So this is going to be our output directory. Double checking we're in batch mode. We've turned test mode off. Test mode's great because you select this, you only process, a small number of frames, so you don't have to process the entire file just to check and see how your filtration is doing. So this is a great feature, must have. You can increase or decrease the thread count that's being used by the pipeline. I can change my presets here, but I'm using placebo. The reason I'm using placebo, of course, as we discussed earlier, was so that I have access to a number of other filtration options. And this is essentially a visual representation of the script that I showed you earlier. So I'm not going to change anything because this is the way I've set it to the way that I want it. My progress bars are not quite ready yet. They're not quite doing the job. I've got to spend a little bit more time working on the functionality for those. So maybe that'll come in version 2.0 or something. But I'll upload this user interface to my GitHub channel at some point so you guys can use it for free. Just going to give this to the community. I just need to do some more work because it's still kind of janky. Anyway, so the reason I use BTOP is I like to be able to see what's going on under the hood, because if this hangs, I'll of course see, I may see something in the log here, but there's a very good likelihood that it won't necessarily tell me whether or not FFmpeg or VS-Pipe are actually running. So I like to keep an eye on how many threads I'm using, if I'm utilizing all my computational resources. So I think this is a really good tool for developers to have, just to keep an eye on what's happening. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the process, and then I'll see you guys on the other side. I'll tell you a short story about how this conform works. First of all, I had to get my hands on the media, the original media, or as close to the original source as possible, but I also had to find the original project file, and I had to figure out what the film was edited in and how do I extract the timeline so that I could rebuild some of the scenes, the original scenes, as they were edited in the final master edit. And come to find out, it was edited in 2006 on a Macintosh computer in Final Cut Pro 7. So Final Cut Pro 7 is 32-bit, and the last operating system for Mac that was compatible with 32-bit processing software like Final Cut Pro 7 was Mac OS Sierra. So I had to find an old Mac, Intel-based. I had to find an old copy or download a copy of Mac OS Sierra from Apple and install that on the old laptop. And then my wife had an old copy of her Final Cut Pro 7 from way back in the day on an old hard drive. So I took that, I installed it on the system, and when I was in the UK, I picked up the hard drive that had all the original source media as well as the project files and all the different versions of the project, and I had to hunt through and figure out the right one, brought that project in, and I was finally able to export an EDL file from that timeline. And when I brought it into DaVinci Resolve, it was like it was conformed yesterday. It came in perfectly. I mean, there was some sync issues, obviously, and I haven't conformed the entire timeline. I've just conformed this one scene right here, and that's the one that we're going to look at today. And this is the penultimate scene. This is kind of the crescendo of the film when our devil here in the red tie basically presides over a duel between the evil sheriff and the young man who owns the ranch, and his sister, who ends up making the deal with the devil to save the ranch. On video track 1 here in yellow, this is our original AVI source, and I'm using DaVinci Resolve's neural de-interlacer at highest quality, and I've gone in to change the clip attributes so that they are de-interlacing from top field first, just like we've done in Vapoursynth. So I'm basically comparing DaVinci Resolve's most advanced de-interlacing tool against QTGMC and Vapoursynth's de-interlacing. So I wanted to just go ahead and do some comparative analysis visually between the original camera source and our new restored clips from HDVapourize. The reason why I've added film grain here is because you can still see a little bit of the remnants of the discrete cosine transform noise. You can see these little blocks of Fourier frequencies, right, that make up discrete cosine transform. And by adding some film grain on the top, I kind of layer over that and break that up. Also, if we play this, you can see it's still alive. A lot of that DCT noise and blocking is still there, right? It's because I don't want to clean all of it out. If I'm too aggressive and I clean all of it out, then we end up looking like we've done this with Topaz. And that's the whole reason we don't want to use Topaz, because Topaz completely destroys the footage. It makes everything smooth. It makes everything look like plastic. It's a little bit of a black box for some of those more detailed tweaks that you want to make, customized video processing you want to make. I think a lot of people love Topaz, and that's fine. I respect whatever tools people use. Maybe they have their own workflow. But for me, I've always ended up destroying or decimating some detail that I don't necessarily want to decimate. anytime you process raw material, not necessarily purely raw, RAW, but like original source, anytime you process that original source, it's destructive. It's a destructive process. You're always going to throw away some information. That's why maybe another 20 years from now, since this film is almost 20 years old, maybe another 20 years from now, Vapoursynth or some new tool will be out that processes this video and de-interlaces in a much more advanced way that, in fact, you can actually recover more information. Maybe the interpolation, field interpolation will become more advanced. Maybe AI will become more advanced. Who knows? One thing I can say for certain is that at the moment, anytime you process original source material, you're going to destroy or throw away something. So the question really is, how much are you going to throw away? How much are you going to decimate? And that's the deal that you make with the devil, so to speak. You are, you are trying to enhance the material in an apparent way. If we were doing media preservation, we wouldn't touch this. We would simply document it, add metadata to it, and store it in a new container that might be more future-proof, but you always keep the original, and then you never touch it, right? But we want to enhance the material in a way that it looks better, that it has an apparent increase in quality or an apparent increase in detail. And so that's what you're going to see today. You're going to see compromise. You're not going to see a super advanced, hyper upscale, perfect. That doesn't exist. And that's the way Topaz works. Topaz works this way. If you actually zoom in on something, when you process video in Topaz, you'll notice things get a little trippy. There's all these telltale signs, these like little, I call it hooping, these little telltale signs of AI trying to enhance detail, but it convolves something that wasn't necessarily originally there. And this restoration has really been focused on trying to get the de-interlacing right so that we interpolate the fields in a way that we can pick up on the type of detail that we really are interested in. So a really good example of this is something like this. This is the original, okay? This is our newly de-interlaced. So we've cleaned, you notice this, that we've reduced the apparent presence of the discrete cosine transform noise. That's by discrete cosine transform, I mean these little blocks with lines in them, right? The mathematics that's used to create specific frequency patterns in a little block that may or may not resemble the original texture behind what was captured pixel by pixel. But by de-interlacing this in a better way, we can actually reconstruct objects in the frame in such a way that it's much more temporally accurate. So just keep in mind that this lesser quality version, this is the AVI that's being de-interlaced by DaVinci Resolve's neural engine. Okay. Now, granted, I've done some color grading, just to color correct on this. I've done a color transform, and I've also popped the contrast a little bit. But regardless of that, you can tell that we've definitely reconstructed this object temporally in such a way that it spatially looks like it's higher resolution. It kind of is. Not higher resolution, but it's more detail, right? So this is something, you go from HD to 4K. It's not true 4K, of course, but this is all about image processing for restoration like this, for HDV. It's more about creating the apparent increase in quality. Are we objectively increasing the quality, or are we subjectively increasing the quality? And the different tools that you use will provide different kinds of trades. There's a trade-off between what you decimate and what you gain. So the real question for me during this restoration process was, what can I do to this footage that will increase the quality, the apparent quality, so much globally that even if I maybe throw away some detail in some ways, which I'll show you in a little bit, the overall global consensus on the subjective increase in quality is a thumbs up. All right, that's what we want. I can already tell you now that this is better subjectively. I haven't done a quantitative analysis, right, between the original and this new restored version, so I can't give you a number, right? It's just how I feel. It's how I look at the footage and I feel it. And the one thing I will say is that for all of the inconvenience of discrete cosine transform noise, after a few years of doing this, I've started to respect DCT. I've started to respect that noise a little bit, because when you zoom out, discrete cosine transform noise is horrible when you look at it up close. It's horrible. It's all weird. It's got all these weird shapes. It's like fuzzy, sparkly. I mean, look at this. It's awful. It's like breaks up the shape of his eyes. But you see how the DCT, these discrete cosine transform, they have these hard edges. They're like blocks. When you zoom out, that becomes sharp. It's like sharpening, because it has an angular presence, and the angularity, if that's the right word to use, of that block gives apparent sharpness and apparent detail. And actually, it really works when it comes to whiskers or hair. Okay, mine is popping, and that's part of the strategy here, but sometimes that discrete cosine transform can increase the apparent sharpness of an object or a detail in the frame. So I just wanted to at least say that. So respect, you know, like I don't want to just clean everything. This is the thing. When I first started doing restoration, I was cleaning everything out. I was like smoothing everything out. I was like, oh man, get rid of all that junk. Just denoise it, run it through Neat Video and denoise it. And then over time, working with a bunch of folks in the restoration process, I started noticing people were like, hey, you know, like I can't see that hair anymore. What happened to the hair? What happened to the skin, the pores in the skin? We've over smoothed. We've been too aggressive. And it was always too aggressive, too aggressive, too aggressive. And eventually I've come to the conclusion as a professional that light touch is always best. People expect you to go, you know, people drop something into Topaz, they press the process button, and then out spits out this super sharp, highly apparently detailed object. But when you zoom into it, when you're scrutinizing it with a client, and the client is zooming in on their laptop, they're like, whoa, what is that? Those are weird artifacts. It looks like plastic. So we're really splitting hairs here, so to speak. Let me just zoom in on the hair, since we're on the topic of hair. I'm going to zoom out, okay? Can't really see that discrete cosine noise here, right? When you zoom in, you can really see it. DCT noise is prevalent in HDV because of the codec that was used at the time, and you know, if engineers from 2001 could time travel to 2025 and take some of the more advanced image processing algorithms and apply them, we would be in a better position here. But that's just not possible. You know, they were using the mathematics and engineering of the day, and so some of that's limited. But you can really tell that we've cleaned out a lot of the DCT, and what we've done is we've kind of removed some of that DCT chunks and this noise, and we've just revealed what was underneath it a little bit more, right? And then if I add film grain to that to kind of cover my tracks a little bit, of course, I'm not totally happy with this film grain. I want to keep working on it. We cover our tracks. We smooth out some of the vacuum that's been left by processing all that DCT noise out and the macro blocking out. Let's see how it handled the low end, actually. Oh yeah. So it's, zooming in here, you can see the DCT and the blocking has really broken up the texture of the hair. And if I turn off the grain, you can see even more, right? So, right, again, that DCT block is there. It's still there, right? But it's just lesser pronounced. And then when we put the film grain over the top of it, we lose a little bit of the detail, right? But we're covering our tracks a little bit. So I might back off of the grain slightly. Let's look at the eye. Oof. Wow. I mean, let me turn off the grain so you can see. It's so strange because I'll show you another clip in a minute where we do decimate detail from the original. Look at the pores. I find that my Vapoursynth script has slightly over-processed, and this is where discrete cosine transform noise really shines, because you see all of the sparkly bits here, all of those little dots, they're gone in the restoration. And I kind of miss that in the skin because, like I said, DCT noise or DCT is actually can be good in certain situations because it allows us to get in there and add very fine sub-block detail, and when you zoom in it may sparkle and it may look like crap, but actually it's doing a job. So this is something that I compromised on, because you can see now that cleaning out a lot of that DCT noise has a huge advantage in reclaiming some of the structural integrity of the scene, but we lose the advantage of that sparkly sub-block detail in some cases. For example, like skin pores or sometimes hair. But I gotta say, this is a big step change in apparent quality. Now this is a really good example of how DCT decimation can actually get rid of texture. We've done a great job with her eye. Let me turn off the film grain. We've done a great job with her eye. Oh my God, look at that. That's such a difference. Such a difference. But I remember even on set, this actress, her skin was like, she was like a porcelain doll. Perfect skin. I think the makeup artist went a little heavy with with the blush. That's something we can always tame in the color grade. But that means that really kind of the only texture that we get in her skin is through the discrete cosine transform noise, through the little blocking. And because we've cleaned that out and because her skin is so smooth, we kind of smooth out some of that texture. And that's the kind of compromise I was talking about. I know I keep talking about DCT, but DCT is a big deal with HDV and mini DV. It's even worse with mini DV because you're working with less resolution, so you have less granularity. Yeah, okay, so this is a good example. I feel like we've over-smoothed the hair a little bit. I will say we've reclaimed structural integrity, right? This looks like a mess. And then when we run it, when I show you the before and after here, you can see that like the apparent increase in quality is significant. But we've lost a little bit of the sparkle of that discrete cosine transform. And I also think that my horizontal smoothing tool that we used earlier, I think that also was a little bit too aggressive. So I might want to get back into the hood for a clip like this and back off on that horizontal smoothing a little bit. It's nice to see the shape. And when I say structural integrity, I'm not trying to sound like a Star Trek nerd, but I'm like, it's just the structure is less broken up by DCT blocks and noise. And so you get these nice smooth lines. I can see a little bit of the chromatic interlacing artifacts. Maybe that's DCT actually, but I'll show you another example of that in a minute. The structure of the lips is great. See, this is what I'm talking about right here. We lose that little sparkle on the edge of her lip. And when you zoom out, that little sparkle, it's not so bad when you zoom out, but it's just, you can tell that that little sparkle on the edgy and the sharp edgy DCT noise and blocks, I'm kind of missing it a little bit. But, you know, that is what it is. That's the compromise I made. So I'll keep working on this. Let's look at her eyebrow. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's a great eyebrow. Sweet. I love it. It's done a great job with this one. Okay, so we're going to talk about something. I'm just going to be honest and say that I was a little too aggressive. I'm going to have to go back into this clip and the way that we process our chroma channels or chroma planes separately, both temporally and spatially. And the reason why that's important to note is because if you process your chroma and luma separately and you use different temporal methods of processing those channels separately or those planes separately, you can get color ghosting, chroma ghosting. So for fast moving objects, watch this. Watch the fingers. Look, the chroma is out ahead of it. There it is again. We've got this ghosting, or chroma ghosting. And that's because the luma and chroma are not in sync. Okay, so that's something you have to really be careful with fast moving objects that are processed a certain way. So I'm going to have to go back in and tweak how I process this clip. See, this is a super fast shot, so it doesn't necessarily work very well here. So I'm going to have to use a different strategy for this clip. Just something to be aware of. I wanted to choose this shot here of this clock because it's a good example of how QTGMC using when using, say, a slower mode or a placebo, when you lend the computational resources to QTGMC to allow it to restructure the image by interpolating the missing field lines when you're taking 50i. In this case, this film was shot in PAL because we were in the UK. We're going from 50 independent fields per second to 25 individual progressive frames per second. You need to interpolate the missing fields per frame. So what we're doing here is we're just using a much more sophisticated way of restructuring a spatial image using temporal data. And the reason why the picture of this watch is a good example in order to let us compare is because there's a lot of angular structure here. Straight lines, there's little gear teeth that would really, if you weren't interpolating the fields correctly, would really be destroyed. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this just to compare the two. Watch these teeth right here. These fine edges, right? Straight edges are recombined, rebuilt, and structured in a way that makes them more clear. So we have increased clarity and strength in the structure. I never noticed the little ruby before. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and just turned off the DaVinci Neural Engine de-interlacing in DaVinci Resolve settings. You can find that if you go to settings and then image scaling, you can choose the resize filter and algorithm that you use to resize, but you can also change your de-interlace quality. I always recommend using the DaVinci Neural Engine. In most cases, sometimes it fails and you get less optimal results. But This is just to show you how diagonal lines and structure is just not reconstructed properly. You can even see, look at this. These are chroma combing artifacts. So the algorithm that's used to deinterlace this material is just not, it's not sufficiently able to reconstruct the chroma channels during the deinterlacing process. Now, QTGMC, as advanced and sophisticated as it is, sometimes will still impart the same chromatic combing artifacts. And that's why in this script I had utilized vertical smoothing to try and process the color in a way that I blended those hard transitions. So you can see here you've got orange, sort of like a whitish blue, then an orange, then a whitish blue. And that's because this information over here, this more warmer color, is being, those field lines are being reconstructed, but temporally and chromatically they're kind of out of sync. So we're left with this sort of artifact. And that's all, if you look, it's everywhere. There's some more right there. You can see it running side by side. Now, you see how it has this kind of glow? My restored version has kind of glow. That's the result of vertical smoothing. In fact, you can kind of almost make out some of that. Here, this is a really good example. 1, 2, 3, 4, those lines. 1, 2, 3. It's just harder to make out because I've smoothed that those chromatic combing artifacts out a little bit. Now, the reason why that stuff is around still is not because QTGMZ may have failed at processing those chromatic channels correctly, but it may be an inherent issue in the camera and how it encoded the color. So we have to sometimes we have to cheat a little bit, and we have to use other tools to, like vertical smoothing or horizontal smoothing, to get rid of some of these latent artifacts, combing artifacts. It's a little hot. My color grade's a little hot, so I might want to, let's see, highlight, roll off. There we go. Just to take the edge off of that a little bit. Let's look at one more shot, and then I'll show you the comparison with the original DVD release, so that we can kind of compare those two. Now that's definitely unfair because the original DVD release was standard definition, but I guess the point I'm making is that DVD, standard definition DVD version, was the sole distributed version of this film for the last 20 years. So this is the standard definition version is the only thing that anyone has ever seen. I'm the first person on this entire production team to see this in HD. So I'm really excited to do a comparative analysis, but again, it's not really fair. But before we do that, I just wanted to point out one more thing, which is that some of the stitching we've been able to reconstruct in the leather gun belt that our protagonist is wearing, and some of the wood tone, some of the details have been smoothed out and reconstructed in a way that I find it really beautiful, and I'm happy with it. So for example, this is supposed to be a smooth bokeh style out of focus antagonist in the background, covered in discrete cosine transform. And now I haven't put a grade on this one at all. This is just naked as the day it was processed out of Vapoursynth. But we've cleaned up a lot of the discrete cosine transform noise, and as well as built a little bit more fidelity into the fingers. This is the last thing I wanted to show you is this is a really good example of chroma artifacts that have been that are latent, that have been left in the footage, and because this hand is moving, that movement creates a problem for our de-interlacing algorithm that's built into DaVinci Resolve. It's just not quite sophisticated enough to handle that. So this is a good example of why I've added the horizontal and vertical smoothing, as well as spent a little bit more computational resources in processing some of the temporal chromatic data. Now you can tell in the original that there is a hard, clean line between the finger and the background, but of course my smoothing tools that I've implemented into the script has created this kind of fuzzy, it's smoothed out those vertical lines, those combing artifacts. So we are left with a little bit of a glow, a little bit of a chromatic fuzzy glow. And that's what I was talking about earlier. I think I might want to back off the aggressiveness of that just a little bit. And how I would do that is I would back off just enough before I kind of really tell that these combing artifacts are there, and then I would stop. What I definitely don't want to do is I don't want to create this sort of over-smoothed, glowy type of color mash all over the image. It's done a really good job. Don't get me wrong. I just think that we can do it a little bit better. I mean, this isn't even what even is that? I can't even tell that's a finger if I've zoomed in all the way. And now we've reconstructed everything. Even the quick of the nail is back, right? This is great. This is a really great example of how QTGMC, when given enough processing power and enough parameters that are tweaked to optimize, is just how effective it can be. So anyway, okay, so let's move on to compare the DVD. What shot should I? Let's just start with this shot. Okay. Where is it? There it is. There it is. Aha. Okay. Not even in the same universe, man. Not even in the same universe. Even the texture and the fabric is gone. And I don't even know how this was encoded back. This DVD may have been encoded very poorly using, you know, because I know back in the day, whenever you would do DVD encoding, you could use multipass. There were different parameters and tools that you could use to really encode the best quality MPEG-2 encode as possible for the DVD. But so I have no paper trail, no documentation to tell us how this was encoded. I'm just assuming based on common practice for, you know, amateur filmmakers back in the day. So it's interesting how the MPEG-2 just kind of encodes large chunks in SD. You know, it's optimized for SD. Look at the belt buckle. Huh. Also, I noticed the buckle on his hat kind of comes into focus a little bit more as well. Yep. Again, totally unfair. Ah, look at the, I gotta say, however it was de-interlaced back in the day, did not leave any of those combing artifacts that DaVinci Resolve today is generating or leaving. It's a testament to however it was de-interlaced back in the day and whatever tool we were using. I'm assuming it was DVD Studio Pro or something like that, something by Apple. So they did a good job with that. So not even a competition here. Not even a competition with between SD and HD. But it's kind of fun to look at. Let's find another really cool clip. This is my favorite shot. Now this guy, he was a Clint Eastwood impersonator in the UK. Really, really funny guy. I don't know, he was like an American file, because I know Anglophile, what do you call someone who loves America or was fascinated with American culture? Americophile? I don't know. This guy drove up in a Cadillac, and they don't drive Cadillacs in the UK. This actor showed up in a Cadillac wearing a cowboy hat before we even started filming. So he was the real deal as far as Clint Eastwood impersonators go. So shout out to this guy. I think he was from Manchester. I may be wrong about that, but let's go ahead and find our standard definition version of this. I'll even turn off our grade so that we can really truly compare the two. Yeah, not even close. I mean, standard definition is actually so bad that the discrete cosine transforms from MPEG-2 are not even, or from our source, our HDV source, are not even realized. They're just sort of, they just turn into these blocky, chunky dots. I wanted to quickly show you one of the reasons why I dither and upsample the chroma subsampling and the bit depth before I go into a color grade. It's not perfect. It's not some magical tool. I'm not really truly upsampling the bit depth, but I am using a couple of tools which I showed you in the script that allow me to upsample both chroma subsampling and the from 420 to 422 and the bit depth from 8 bits to 10 bit, and I use a dither to kind of soften that transition between the code levels. Okay, and this really comes down to, now a trained eye can visually see the blocks and the chroma blocks that are left in the original footage, but by dithering and softening those transitions between the blocks, you're creating somewhat cleaner keys, softer keys. So this is the original. I've applied the same exact color grade on top of both of them, and I tried color balancing, but I haven't changed anything else. This is the original .avi file, okay? This is this guy. And I just wanted you to notice the blocky nature of this chroma key. All I've done is I've tried to key this certain saturation value of the skin tone. I've just basically done a very basic chroma key on the skin. This is the AVI file, and this is the restored file. There's just a softening to those blocks, and it may seem very subtle and, I don't know, esoteric, but take it from a colorist when I say that this provides a lot more smoother of a key when you're doing changes like changing skin tones, or if you're trying to pull a certain color out of the skin tones. The blockier the image is, the more it sparkles later. And by sparkling, I mean this. Right? You can even see some of the, look at the de-interlacing artifacts, the chroma combing artifacts that are latent in the original AVI file, whereas this file is just a lot smoother, and those chroma combing artifacts are nearly gone. They're not completely gone, but they are much less prevalent, and those don't show up in the key either. Okay, so you see there's definitely a difference between, this is almost like a dreamy sparkle, whereas this is a hard, blocky sparkle with hard transitions between blocks. Okay, I just want to give you an example. That's why I do that. I think people are like, you can't upsample bit depth, and oh no, you can't, but you can definitely, there's some tricks you can use to soften the transitions in those blocks and get cleaner keys later on. That's the whole reason I did that.
I've been tricked.
Okay, I'm going to take you through my color grading process. I'm going to use this shot as an example because this is my favorite shot, and this is my hero shot. This is what I want to build the look from, so I'm going to start here. So this is our freshly Vapoursynth HD vaporized source clip. And remember that we applied a transform to the color science of the source media, because my assumption is that this was encoded with DCI-P3 primaries and coefficients in the camera, as unlikely as that sounds. So I'm just going to continue working under that assumption, since that's the color management that I applied in the processing, in the restoration pipeline to begin with. This is my node tree. Okay, I have many different node tree flavors, and this happens to be the one that I want to use because I have a couple of restorative tools built into this, as well as some film print emulation tools built into this node tree. It's typically the node tree that I use when I'm restoring. But the thing that I always start with, of course, is my color management, and that should always be your last node in the tree, because you want to work with your working color space prior to that final color transform out. And it's just best practices to always put your color conversion in the end. You want to work with that big, fat, juicy DCI P3 color space. You don't want to work within the confines of a restricted Rec. 709 color space, even though in DaVinci Resolve or floating point. But it's best practices in general. So our input color space is DCI P3. Or P3 DCI. I guess they've decided to rename it in Resolve. It's a little bit weird, but and then our gamma curve, our input gamma, is DCI, and Rec. 709 is our out. As that's what we just assume that we're going to be distributing via Rec. 709 moving forward, since we are not doing an HDR 4K. We're not doing an HDR remaster, and here we're staying within the Rec. 709 code levels. So the other thing that I always do when I'm doing a color transform is I'm applying a saturation compression that just helps tame a little bit more of those wild, errant chromatic pops before we go into the full Rec. 709 out pipeline. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the effects there. And so this is our base clip that we'll be working from. And my first inclination, if I'm going to look at my scopes, but just by eye, I can tell you that this image looks a little dead. Okay, so let's put some life into it. I'm just going to go ahead and select my exposure node and go over to HDR, and then I'm just lift up my exposure. I'm going to be careful to not break anything. Let's go ahead and show extents as well. And what I'm really looking for is I don't want to start mashing the highlights, the speculars, and things like that on the skin or in the image. I'm also keeping an eye on the sky, making sure we've got that nice color there. And I'm also watching to make sure that we don't push those speculars up and break them. So yeah, I might push that a little bit more. Yeah, that's nice. On the very, very tip of his nose, we've got a little bit of a specular, but I'm gonna fix that. I've got a little highlight roll-off tool, but sometimes it's a little aggressive and it makes it flat. So let's go ahead and look at our scopes again. I typically have my scopes on another monitor, but because we're doing this in for YouTube on a single display, I have to turn my scopes on and off. I think that, so I'm going to just audition that for you so you can see. We're really just affecting the very, very tippy top, top 30% of the waveform, really. But I think it's a little too aggressive, and so one way that I deal with that is I just change the opacity of that highlight roll-off node. And I'm looking right here at this little spot, just to make sure that I'm not flattening that specular too much, and I want to make sure that that specular has a nice shape to it. So let's look at our waveform. Yeah. So sometimes when you roll the highlights off like this, you can kind of deaden the image so it doesn't have as much of a pop. So I really want to utilize all of the code levels on my output just so that it's more dynamic and there's more contrast. But film typically, you know, has a maximum amount of brightness. When you're projecting film in the cinema, there's only so much luminance that you can transmit through a medium like this before it starts to go flat or before it starts to hit a ceiling. So I definitely don't want it to be super crisp highlight, super bright highlight digital look, but I also don't want it to be too dead. So I'm trying to find a happy medium there. It seems like that's a good happy medium. Let's keep our scopes up for a minute, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my black level and set our contrast. So what do I want to do here? I want to apply a curve. We're going to add editable splines. So now we have this little knob here. And I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast with a little bit of an S-curve here. All the while keeping an eye on my speculars that we were just repairing earlier. It is it's supposed to be the hot Arizona or hot Texas sun. So I want it to be hot. I want it to be crisp and sweaty. So I'm okay with it popping a little bit there. But when I go away from this and I come back to it, I may end up changing my mind. I want to pull back on that a little bit. So I can already tell you right now, I want to increase our roll off just ever so slightly, keeping an eye on the shape of that. Yeah. That looks a lot better. I haven't mashed the tonal values on the lower 20% of the waveform either. I've still got a nice shape to my black level. Now I'm going to take my log tool, because that's a much more granular control over the three primary regions in your waveform. Watch this. If I change the log, I'm on standard, not HDR, standard log. Watch my waveform down here. I want to get that black level a little bit lower. Okay, but I'm also making sure I'm not mashing the lower end of the waveform into a mess. So I'll give you an example of that. Look, see, that's a mess. I've lost all detail. There's no depth to the shadows there. So I'm just going to go ahead and reset that. Now, right here seems to be the darkest part of the waveform, and I'm watching the wave. We're not breaking. We're not down in the very, very bottom. We're not hitting the very, very bottom. But I definitely want to make sure that I'm not mashing that too much. But you know what? Another trick that I like to play, because now this is starting to look great. However, sometimes I like to make my blacks a little floaty, a little creamy, just to have a little bit of that low-con look. So what I typically do is after my Rec 709 transform, I'll just take that, go back to log, and take that, and I'll bring it back up. And it just kind of gives a milkiness to it, right? Without lifting that black level back, without undoing the work I've just done. So let me just change that right there. Nice little soft toe on the bottom there. I'm going to label that toe. Cool. So far so good. This is looking cool. I feel like the speculars are a little intense. So I just want to bring that down a tad, just a tad. Watching my waveform again. Yeah. Okay, cool. Next thing I want to do is add some detail. Now the thing that I love about old westerns on film is sometimes you can see they had this like crispness to the wrinkles. It's this intense texture. And I do that with mid-tone detail. Now this, I think it's also called, well, coarsening. It depends on what software tool you're using. But I've seen it labeled as coarsening or mid-tone detail. In DaVinci Resolve, it's called mid-tone detail. And if I turn that off, you can see it becomes a little more soft and gentle, almost like it's got a ProMist filter in front of it. And then when I turn on my mid-tone detail, I get a little bit more of an apparent sharpness and enhancement. But the reason I'm doing that is not necessarily to enhance the apparent sharpness, but I'm actually doing it because I love the grittiness of the Western, the wrinkles, the sun, the leather skin from being a cowboy and working on the ranch or being a gunslinger in the sun in the mid-19th century. But I also don't want to overdo it because then you get that kind of stereotypical over mid-tone detail over sharpening. It's not sharpening, but it's like over coarsening. I think it's actually a little too much, so I might want to back off a little bit. And I also like to typically add just a tiny bit of sharpness. I never go below 48. So I'm going to audition that. I'll zoom in here so you can see it on your YouTube. That's before. This is after. Before and after. I don't want to sharpen because then you start adding, you start getting sharpening artifacts, right? I just want to make the texture pop. That's what I'm doing. I should have said that from the beginning. That makes more sense. So, okay. I am making the texture pop there a little bit. I think that the skin is a little too red, bluish, magenta. So I'm just going to do a quick key. Now I could go in and do a power window so that I don't key the ground of the background that's very close to his skin color. But I'm just doing, I want to do global adjustments, you know, work smarter, not harder. I don't want to create a bunch of work for myself later. I want to make as many global adjustments as I can before having to get in and do power windows and detail and all that stuff. And then we'll see if we can get away with by lowering the saturation. Might want to increase the softness of that low end a little bit. Okay, and I might want to create a little more softness to the low end of the saturation. I also want to do a denoise, and the reason is because I'm getting a little bit of this macro blocking here. So let's just do 10, smooth that out. Because what ends up happening is if I were to press play, you'll see the sparkle, right? So the problem with that is if you have hard edges, then that sparkling becomes much more apparent. And I might even do a little post filter on that as well. Okay. That's a pretty solid key for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my color channels. I'm just going to take a tick of blue out of that. That's actually great. It's very subtle, but I love it. I just pulled a little bit of the magenta, a little bit of that blue, the bluish pinky out of it, and put in a little bit more warmth and yellow. And we're in Texas after all. That's where I'm from. I'm from West Texas. So I consider myself a bit enough of an authority on what the light looks like on skin. And we're going for dusty yellow. Now the thing that I notice about this frame is we've got yellowish orange rocks in the back. We've got green, somewhat unsaturated, but green foliage in the background as well. And there's a little bit of green on his hat on the low end. And I can even see it right here. Our blue's down, our red is down, but I can see that we've got a little bit of a green on the very, very low end. So I want to pull some of that out. Okay. I'm not going to affect my key, but I will go into primary RGB. And I'm going to go in here just on my log tool, and I'm going to pull, and watch my waveform. You'll see how aggressive this is. See how much I can move that? It may be hard for you to see on YouTube, obviously, but subtlety is the key. But you can see the green channel right here. This is where it was, and this is where it is now. I've just pulled a little bit of the green out of the very, very low end to balance that a little bit. The other thing that I noticed about Kodak is sometimes there's a little bit of blue in the very, very low end, so I might want to just lift that up just ever so slightly. Great. I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. I'm noticing that our color palette is still pretty flat. Still pretty flat. So what I want to do is I want to add, I've got this subtractive saturation tool that's really awesome. It's a little bit different than standard saturation in that whenever you increase subtractive saturation, it's almost like it increases the thickness of the paint or like the richness of the paint. I feel like standard saturation can sometimes look a little cartoony. So subtractive saturation in this case is the right tool to use. So in order to do that, I'm going to go and I'm going to push it up a lot first to see where my limits are. And you can actually really start to see the color of the skin there. This is a really nice warm pink tone. So let's reset that. That's nice. That's great. It's very subtle. Subtlety, I feel like in color grading, sometimes subtlety is key. You don't want to over push stuff. You don't want to push stuff too far. But this just adds a little bit more richness to the image without making it look too hyper stylized or cartoony. But I'm noticing even though I've added richness to the image, the background is very flat. The color science on an XL-H1 and HDV in general, I remember the XL-H1 being quite low in chromatic detail and saturation. I shouldn't say detail, but kind of is. It's like, even when I was looking through the color viewfinder back in the day, the image was always very flat. I didn't know what to do about it because I didn't have the skills at the time. But one thing that we can do here is we've got this lovely skin tones in the foreground, right in the center of the frame, right where you're looking right into this guy's eyes. You're looking at his wrinkles in his skin, and you're just captivated by this man's face. But the periphery kind of just falls off chromatically. And the one thing that we can do in this image is we can increase the saturation and the presence of the green foliage in the background and create that chromatic contrast, and that'll make it pop. And I think after that, I'm going to make the sky pop just a little bit, maybe like 10, 15, 20%. And then we'll have a little bit more of a rich image, right? So let's start with the foliage. I'm going to label this node foliage, and then we'll do another one called sky. Now I have to be really careful here because green is a very strong color. It's the first thing that we notice. And I don't want to make the bush a little too saturated. I just want to bring it to our attention. So I'm just taking a little bit of a sample. Okay, it's quite a big key. I'm going to soften that. We're going to decrease the width and get rid of all of those warm tones. We don't want to touch those warm tones. I don't want to get anywhere near them. And I'm starting to see over here, there's a bit of a blend. Between the more magenta reddish regions. I don't want to get any of that. I only want the green. And of course there are some spots that are completely just don't have any color information. So we're not going to get a clean key there. But I'm not worried about that so much because the way the human eye works is the darker the scene, the less color sensitivity there is. That's why we always try and remove color from the very, very low end because it looks artificial otherwise. This is not the cleanest key because I'm still picking up the darkest of darks up in the hat. So I want to get rid of that. And if I have to bleed into the hat a little bit just to get a clean key on the bush, so be it, because I can always add something. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do it right now. Let's completely eliminate anything that's not a bush from the top. If we're getting a conflicting key, I'm only caring about the bushes here in the bottom. I don't care about all this stuff in the top half of the frame. So that's a good spot right there. I feel like that's good. Now we're just keying the bushes. There's a little bit of a mess there. And there's still hard edges on these blocks. So let's smooth that out and do a little post filter on that. We're still going to get a sparkle, but that's okay, because this is why you want to be really subtle when you reintroduce color. I'm also going to make this a little softer. That's a little bit too much. Oh, yeah. I'm going to be really, really careful. I'm going to soften that out as much as I can. So I just don't want the sparkles. Okay. Let's try popping the saturation first. And then we will add green and pull blue out. Oh yeah, we're already getting, look at that. It makes a huge difference. I'm going to put a little bit more red into that and a little bit more blue into the green, just because it was a little too cartoony green. Let's add, you know what? Let's take it up to 70 saturation and see what that looks like. All right, I'm going to audition that. That's before. This is after. I'm going to add one more tick of green just to make it pop a little bit more. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Let's just make sure it doesn't sparkle. Looks good. Looks good, man. I'm happy with that. Okay, let's move on to the sky. We should get a pretty clean key on this. It's a very specific luminance value, and noticing it's not getting the sky up in the very top right hand corner. That may be because we've got, let's take our saturation all the way down. Yep, okay. Got the sky. Now let's start eliminating the bill of the hat there, that little band on the hat. Let's soften it up. Do a little post filter. We can even clean the black a little bit. It's a little too aggressive on the top right, so I'm going to back off on that. Okay, now we've got a clean key of our sky. Maybe we just bop the saturation. Maybe that's all it needed, was a little bit of a pop. Okay, that's all I got for you today, but I really want to thank you for taking the time to come by my channel and watch this video. I know it's been a little bit of a longer one, but lots of detail. I hope you learned something. I definitely learned a few things while working on this, and it's also been awesome taking a stroll down memory lane with one of my earliest films. It just reminded me the passion and excitement that I had when I first got into this business years ago. And I miss the crew, miss the cast. Maybe we'll work on another movie together someday. But until then, please like and subscribe if you liked this video, and come back for my next video sometime. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. And until next time.